Excuse me, sir, but I don't think you understand. This section is reserved for our premium passengers. The words cut through the ambient noise of American Airlines Flight 2847 like a blade through silk. David Williams stood frozen in the aircraft doorway, his boarding pass clutched in his left hand, his leather briefcase in his right. The crisp morning light filtered through the airplane windows, casting shadows across his perfectly pressed charcoal suit. Rebecca Martinez, a 28-year-old flight attendant with carefully styled blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, blocked his path to first class. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture rigid with the kind of authority that comes from years of dealing with difficult passengers. But there was something different in her tone today, something that made the other passengers turn their heads. David's boarding pass clearly showed Seat 2A first class. His American Airlines Platinum Frequent Flyer card gleamed in his wallet, a testament to over 2 million miles traveled with the airline. The Armani suit he wore cost more than most people's monthly salary. His Italian leather shoes reflected the cabin lights. Everything about him screamed success, achievement, belonging. Yet here he stood being told he didn't understand where he belonged. "There's been a mistake," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for people she assumed were lying. "You'll need to move to coach." But what happened next would change not just David's morning, not just his flight, not just his day. What happened next would spark a revolution that would transform an entire industry, inspire millions of people, and prove that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single moment of injustice. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. At 5:30 a.m. that morning in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, the alarm buzzed exactly on time. David Williams had been waking up at this hour for 15 years, ever since he founded Williams Capital Group in a cramped studio apartment in Brooklyn, with nothing but a dream, a laptop, and the last $3,000 in his savings account. Now, as he looked out at the city skyline from his bedroom window, he could see the gleaming tower that housed his company's headquarters. Williams Capital Group managed over $8 billion in assets. They employed 200 people across 5 offices. They had just been named Investment Firm of the Year by Financial Times. But success hadn't erased the memories. David could still remember being 9 years old, watching his grandfather James Williams on the evening news. Grandpa James had been a civil rights activist in the 1960s, marching with Dr. King, organizing sit-ins fighting for dignity and equality. The old man used to tell David stories about being refused service at restaurants, being forced to give up his seat on buses, being told he didn't belong in places his money could afford. "Never let them see you angry, son," his grandfather would say, his weathered hands holding David's small ones. "Anger gives them permission to dismiss you. Stay calm, stay strong, and change the world, one mind at a time." David's father had carried that lesson forward. Robert Williams became the first black executive at IBM in the 1980s, enduring decades of subtle racism, microaggressions, and systemic barriers. He taught David that success was the best revenge, but also the heaviest burden. "Every door you walk through," his father had said on his deathbed, his voice weak but his message strong. "You're not just representing yourself. You're representing everyone who looks like you, who couldn't walk through that door before." Now David carried that weight on his shoulders every single day. In the kitchen, Sarah was already up preparing breakfast, while reviewing patient charts on her iPad. Dr. Sarah Williams was a pediatrician at Mount Sinai, specializing in treating children from underserved communities. They had met in graduate school 15 years ago, and she had supported David through every late night, every failed deal, every moment of doubt. "Big day today," she said, looking up from her charts with a smile that still made his heart skip after all these years. "The biggest," David replied, pouring his coffee with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation. If this merger goes through with Rothschild European Partners, we'll be managing $12 billion by the end of the year. Maya bounded into the kitchen in her school uniform, her backpack already loaded with textbooks and art supplies. At 8 years old, she was brilliant, curious, and completely unaware of the racial barriers that her father navigated every day. David wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. "Daddy, you promised we'd have dinner together tonight," Maya said, wrapping her arms around his waist, her head barely reaching his chest. "You've been working late all week." David knelt down to look into his daughter's eyes, the same deep brown as his own. On the refrigerator behind her, he could see her latest drawing, a stick figure, "Family with My Hero Dad," written in purple crayon underneath. His throat tightened as he looked at it. "I promise, sweetheart. I'll be home by 6. We'll order pizza and watch that movie you picked out. Promise, 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 promise." As he kissed Maya goodbye and headed for the door, David felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about money or business success. The merger with Rothschild would establish Williams Capital as a global player, opening doors for other minority-owned firms, creating opportunities for young people who looked like Maya to see themselves in boardrooms and corner offices. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Private jet has mechanical issues. Booked you on AA 2847, 7:30 a.m. departure. First class seat 2A. David sighed, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. He had been flying his private jet for the past 5 years, partly for convenience, but partly to avoid the subtle racism that still plagued commercial aviation. The questioning looks when he sat in first class, the random additional security screenings, the assumptions that he was an athlete or entertainer rather than a businessman. But today was different. Today he would fly commercial, arrive at the meeting, close the deal, and be home in time to keep his promise to Maya. He had no idea that in 2 hours, his life would change forever. During the ride to JFK Airport, David's mind wandered to a conversation he'd had with his grandfather just weeks before the old man passed away. James Williams was 89 years old, lying in a hospital bed, but his mind was still sharp as a razor. "David," his grandfather had whispered, his voice barely audible above the beeping machines. "I want you to understand something. Every generation has to fight the same fight, just in different ways. My generation fought for the right to sit at lunch counters. Your father's generation fought for the right to sit in boardrooms. Your generation has to fight for the right to exist in those spaces without constantly proving you belong." Those words echoed in David's mind as he went through security at JFK. The TSA agent, a middle-aged white man with tired eyes, looked at David's ID for longer than necessary, comparing the photo to his face multiple times. "Business or pleasure?" the agent asked, his tone suggesting David needed to justify his presence. "Business," David replied calmly, his grandfather's voice in his head. "Stay calm, stay strong. What kind of business?" It was a question the agent didn't ask the white passengers ahead of him in line. David could feel the familiar tension building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Investment management," David said simply. The agent finally handed back his ID with a grunt, and David moved through to the gate area. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed the subtle looks, the way some people's eyes lingered on him just a moment too long, trying to place him, trying to figure out if he belonged in this space. At the gate, he settled into a chair and pulled out his phone to review emails. One message made him smile, a photo from Sarah showing Maya's latest art project, a drawing of an airplane with Daddy's big day written above it in her careful 8-year-old handwriting. He typed back, "Tell her I love it. See you both tonight." But as he looked around the gate area, observing the other first-class passengers, David noticed something that had become all too familiar. He was the only black passenger in the premium boarding group, the only one. This shouldn't matter, he told himself. Success was colorblind. Money was colorblind. Business was colorblind. But as he would soon discover, the world wasn't quite as colorblind as he hoped. Williams Capital Group represented more than just David's personal success. The company managed pension funds for teachers' unions, invested in small businesses in underserved communities, and had helped launch dozens of minority-owned startups. The Rothschild merger would expand their reach exponentially, bringing European markets within their grasp and establishing Williams Capital as a truly global firm. David had spent 3 years courting Rothschild European Partners. The due diligence process had been exhaustive, with teams of lawyers and accountants dissecting every aspect of Williams Capital's operations. They had passed every test, exceeded every benchmark, answered every question. The merger would make David one of the youngest black executives to run a global investment firm. More importantly, it would prove that minority-owned businesses could compete at the highest levels of international finance. But the stakes were personal too. David's father had died of a heart attack at 55, worn down by decades of fighting subtle racism in corporate America. His grandfather had lived to see the civil rights movement succeed, but had never seen a black man lead a major Wall Street firm. This merger was David's chance to honor their legacy, to prove that their sacrifices had meaning, to open doors that had been closed for generations. His phone rang. Michael Chen, his business partner and best friend. "David, you sound tense. Everything okay? Just thinking about Dad and Grandpa James, what they went through to get me here. They'd be proud of you, man. You know that, right?" "I hope so, Michael. I really hope so." As David boarded Flight 2847, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders. He was carrying the dreams of his family, the hopes of his employees, the aspirations of every young black entrepreneur who saw him as proof that anything was possible. He had no idea that in the next hour, all of those dreams would hang in the balance. "Excuse me, sir, but I don't think you understand. This section is reserved for our premium passengers." There it was, the moment that would change everything. David Williams stood in the aircraft doorway, boarding pass in hand, facing Rebecca Martinez and her unwavering smile. Around them, other passengers were beginning to notice the commotion, their conversations dying away as they turned to watch. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." David said, his voice calm and professional, despite the anger building in his chest. He held up his boarding pass, the letters 2A, first class clearly visible. "This is my seat assignment." Rebecca took the boarding pass and examined it as if it were a potential forgery. She turned it over, held it up to the light, compared it to something on her tablet. The examination was theatrical, designed to humiliate. "I'm going to need to verify this," Rebecca said finally, her tone suggesting she found David's claim dubious. "There's been a computer glitch. You'll need to step aside while I sort this out." David felt the familiar fire building in his chest, the same anger his grandfather had warned him about. But he also felt something else, the weight of every eye in the cabin on him, the pressure of representing more than just himself, the knowledge that his reaction would be judged not just as David Williams, but as a black man in a space where some people clearly thought he didn't belong. He took a deep breath and channeled his grandfather's voice. "Stay calm. Stay strong. I'd be happy to wait while you verify," David said, his voice steady. "But I'd prefer to wait in my assigned seat." A businessman in seat 3C, a white man in his 50s wearing a Rolex that probably cost more than most people's cars, looked up from his Wall Street Journal. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone suggesting that David was the problem. "No problem at all," David replied evenly, even as his heart raced. "Just a seating question that I'm sure will be resolved quickly." But Rebecca was already signaling to someone in the back of the plane. Within moments, a supervisor appeared. James Peterson, a man in his early 50s with graying temples and the kind of corporate authority that came from years of dealing with difficult passengers. "What seems to be the issue?" Peterson asked. But his eyes were already on David, sizing him up, making assumptions. "This gentleman claims to have a first-class ticket," Rebecca said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "But there's been a computer glitch." Peterson examined David's boarding pass with the same theatrical suspicion as Rebecca, holding it up to the light, checking the back, comparing it to his tablet. The examination went on far longer than necessary, and David realized it was intended to be humiliating, to make him feel like a fraud in front of the other passengers. Sir Peterson said finally, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for people he assumed didn't belong. "I'm going to need to see additional documentation. Your frequent flyer card, your credit card, your ID." Additional documentation for what? David asked, keeping his voice level, even as his hands began to shake with suppressed rage. "I'm a platinum member. I've flown American Airlines for 10 years. I've never had a problem with my seating before." "Company policy," Peterson said curtly. "We need to verify premium upgrades. This wasn't an upgrade. I purchased this seat. We'll see about that." As Peterson made a show of examining David's platinum frequent flyer card, other passengers began to take notice. A woman in seat 1B leaned toward her husband and whispered loudly enough for David to hear, "They really should check these things better at the gate." David's phone buzzed. A text from Maya sent through Sarah's phone. "Have a good flight. Daddy love you." The simple message hit him harder than any of the indignities he was experiencing. His hands trembled as he read it. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the world he was helping to create for his daughter, about the doors he was opening or allowing to be closed. But what David didn't notice was that several passengers were now recording the interaction with their phones. In seat 12C, Maria Santos, a 24-year-old social justice advocate and law student, had her phone out and was live streaming the entire confrontation on TikTok. Maria had 15,000 followers on her Truth Traveler account, where she documented instances of discrimination and injustice during her travels. She had started the account after experiencing her own discrimination as a Latina woman and had built a following of people who were tired of staying silent in the face of inequality. "Good morning, Truth Travelers," she whispered into her phone, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm on American Airlines Flight 2847, and I'm witnessing what appears to be clear discrimination against a black passenger in first class. The man has a valid ticket, valid frequent flyer status, but the crew is treating him like a criminal." The viewer count on her live stream started at 200, her usual morning audience. But as word spread through comments and shares, the numbers began to climb. 500, 800, 1, 200. Comments started flooding in. "This is 2024. Seriously. Call the news document. Everything I've seen this before. It's discrimination. Sue them. Someone find out who this man is." Maria's hands were shaking as she held her phone steady, trying to capture every word of the conversation while staying unnoticed by the flight crew. Meanwhile, Peterson had completed his theatrical examination of David's documents and was now making phone calls. "Yes, this is James Peterson, flight supervisor on 2847. I need to verify a frequent flyer account." He read David's platinum member number, slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone in the cabin could hear. The implication was clear. This black man's status was so suspicious that it required verification from corporate headquarters. David checked his watch, his hands now visibly trembling. 7:45 a.m. The meeting was at 10 a.m. He needed to be in the air in the next 10 minutes to make it on time. 15 years of building Williams Capital, 3 years of courting Rothschild, 6 months of merger negotiations. All of it could be lost because of a flight delay caused by racism. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his business partner, Michael Chen. "David, where are you?" The Rothschild team just arrived early. They want to move the meeting to 9:30. I'm dealing with a situation at the airport, David said quietly, trying to keep his voice from breaking. I'll be there. What kind of situation? David looked around the cabin at the flight crew, treating him like a criminal, at the passengers watching him, like he was entertainment, at the phones recording his humiliation. The kind that reminds you that success doesn't protect you from everything. As Peterson continued his phone calls and document verification theater, the live stream audience continued to grow. Maria's viewer count hit 5,000, and the video was being shared across platforms. American Airlines 2847 started trending locally in New York, and mentions of American Airlines on social media began to spike. In the American Airlines Operations Center at DFW Airport, social media specialist Jennifer Walsh noticed the uptick in mentions. She clicked on the trending hashtag and found herself watching a live stream of what was clearly a discrimination incident unfolding on one of their flights. "Oh no," she whispered immediately, calling her supervisor, her voice tight with panic. Within minutes, the call had escalated to Patricia Chen, American Airlines' Director of Customer Relations, who was having her morning coffee when her phone exploded with notifications. Patricia pulled up the live stream and watched in horror as her employees systematically humiliated a black passenger who clearly had valid documentation for his first-class seat. The viewer count was now approaching 10,000, and the comments were becoming increasingly angry. "Get me flight 2847 on the radio," she barked to her assistant, her coffee growing cold as she watched the company's reputation crumble in real time. "And call legal. We have a problem." But the wheels of corporate bureaucracy move slowly, and change in company culture moves even slower. By the time Patricia's call reached the aircraft, David Williams had been standing in the aisle for 20 minutes, his boarding pass in hand, his dignity under assault, his crucial business meeting slipping away minute by minute. As the situation dragged on, David felt his phone buzzing constantly. Text messages, emails, calls, all related to the merger that was supposed to be the culmination of his life's work. From Michael Chen Rothschild team, asking where you are. From his assistant Bloomberg reporter called. They heard rumors about delays. From the law firm handling the merger, SEC paperwork needs to be signed before market open. Each message represented another piece of his carefully constructed day falling apart. But more than that, they represented the dreams of everyone depending on him, his employees, his investors, his family. Another text from Sarah Maya. Forgot her lunch. I'm dropping it off at school. Hope your flight is going well. Love you. Sarah had no idea what was happening. Maya had no idea that her father was being humiliated in front of strangers, that years of careful reputation building were crumbling in real time, that the future they had planned together hung in the balance of whether he could maintain his composure in the face of systematic racism. David's hands were shaking now as he held his phone. He thought about his grandfather's words, "Stay calm, stay strong, and change the world, one mind at a time." But how do you change minds that are closed? How do you stay strong when the system is designed to break you down? How do you remain calm when everything you've worked for is being threatened by prejudice and ignorance? As if sensing his internal struggle, Peterson returned with a smug expression that made David's stomach turn. "Sir, the system shows your status as valid, but company policy requires additional verification for premium cabin access." "What additional verification?" David asked, his voice barely controlled. "We need to confirm your ability to pay for the ticket." The words hung in the air like a slap. David had just been asked to prove he could afford a first-class ticket, something no white passenger would ever be asked to do. The cabin fell silent. Even the most oblivious passengers understood the racial implications of what had just been said. Maria's live stream exploded with comments. "Did he just say that racism in real time? This is insane. Someone call the CEO. And in that moment, David Williams made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone with hands that trembled with barely controlled rage and dialed a number that would shift the entire balance of power in the conversation. As David pulled out his phone, Maria Santos, in seat 12C, was watching her viewer count explode beyond anything she had ever experienced. What had started as 200 viewers on her TikTok live stream had grown to 25,000 people watching in real time. Her phone was buzzing with notifications as the video was shared across Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and beyond. The hashtag American Airlines 2847 was trending nationally now, and flight discrimination was picking up momentum. But more than just the numbers, it was the comments that told the real story. My father went through this exact same thing in 1987. This happened to me last month on Delta. I'm crying watching this. Nothing ever changes. This man's dignity is being destroyed on live television. Whereas American Airlines management celebrity accounts began resharing the stream, actor Michael B. Jordan retweeted it with the comment, "This is why I fly private, but most people can't. This has to stop." Athlete LeBron James shared it on Instagram. In 2024, we're still fighting for the right to exist in spaces we've paid for. Politician Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "Discrimination in commerce is illegal. Period. American Airlines needs to answer for this immediately." The story was spreading faster than American Airlines' crisis management team could respond. In corporate headquarters, phones were ringing off the hook. Stock price alerts were going off as AA shares began to drop. The company's Twitter account was being flooded with angry messages demanding justice. Maria whispered into her phone, her voice shaking with emotion. "Truth travelers, we're at 50,000 viewers now. This man has been standing here for almost 30 minutes. He has valid documentation. He's being treated like a criminal for existing while black in first class." She panned her camera to show the full scene, David standing calmly in the aisle. Peterson and Rebecca huddled in conversation, other passengers either watching in shock or pointedly looking away. The visual was powerful and damning. As the viewer count climbed toward 100,000, the comments section became a torrent of shared trauma and righteous anger. "This is my father's story from 1963. This is my story from last week. I'm a pilot, and this makes me ashamed of my industry. That man has more class than I would have in this situation. Someone find out who this passenger is and get him a lawyer." American Airlines stock is tanking right now. This is going to be on CNN in an hour. People weren't just watching, they were organizing. Someone created a hashtag, Justice for David, even though they didn't know his name yet. Others were researching American Airlines executives and posting their contact information. The company's social media mentions went from hundreds per hour to thousands per minute. Maria continued her commentary, her voice rising with passion. The flight crew is now having a lengthy discussion about whether this black man who has shown them valid identification, a valid boarding pass, and a platinum frequent flyer card should be allowed to sit in the seat he paid for. Let that sink in. In American Airlines headquarters, CEO Robert Mitchell was pulled out of an executive breakfast meeting by his chief of staff, who looked like he might be sick. "Sir, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Mitchell was shown the live stream on an iPad. As he watched David Williams standing calmly in the aisle while being interrogated by his employees, Mitchell's face went white as paper. "How many people are watching this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. 150,000 and climbing, sir. It's trending #1 on Twitter. CNN is calling for comment. Our stock is down 4% in pre-market trading. Mitchell knew immediately that this was more than a customer service issue. This was a brand-destroying crisis that could cost the company millions in lost bookings, legal settlements, and regulatory fines. Get me the flight crew on the radio. Now. Sir, we've been trying to reach them for 20 minutes. They're not responding to ground control. Then get me a car to JFK. I'm going there myself. As Mitchell raced across New York City in the back of a corporate SUV, his legal team was already preparing for the worst. Discrimination lawsuits, federal investigations, congressional hearings, all possibilities that were becoming more likely with each minute the situation continued. The company's social media team was drafting apology statements, but every version sounded hollow and corporate. How do you apologize for something that's happening in real time, broadcast to hundreds of thousands of people? By 8:15 a.m., major news outlets were scrambling to cover the story. CNN interrupted regular programming with a breaking news alert. MSNBC led with the story on their morning show. Even international outlets like the BBC were picking up the feed. The live stream was being broadcast on television, creating a feedback loop that drove even more viewers to Maria's original stream. Her viewer count hit 300,000, then 500,000. News crews were dispatched to JFK Airport. Radio talk show hosts were taking calls from listeners sharing their own discrimination stories. The incident had become a catalyst for a national conversation about racism in commercial aviation. David's phone was now ringing constantly. Reporters had somehow gotten his number. Civil rights attorneys were calling with offers to represent him. But David wasn't answering any of the calls. He was focused on one thing, maintaining his dignity in the face of systematic humiliation. But there was one call he was waiting for. One number that would change everything. As the viewer count approached 800,000, David made the phone call that would shift the balance of power completely. He scrolled through his contacts and selected a number he rarely used for personal calls. The phone rang once before a crisp, professional voice answered, "Williams Capital Group, this is Susan." In the confined space of the aircraft cabin, everyone could hear both sides of the conversation. Peterson and Rebecca, who had been conferring in hushed tones, looked up in confusion. "Susan, it's David. I need you to connect me to Robert Mitchell at American Airlines. Sir, Mr. Mitchell is the CEO of American Airlines. Are you sure you want?" "I'm sure." "Tell him David Williams is calling from flight 2847. He'll take the call." The cabin fell completely silent. Even the background noise of the aircraft seemed to fade away, as passengers and crew absorbed what they had just heard. Rebecca's face went pale as snow. Peterson fumbled for his tablet, frantically typing something with shaking fingers. The businessman in 3C lowered his Wall Street Journal and stared with his mouth open. Susan's voice came through the phone speaker. "Sir, I'm showing multiple urgent messages about flight 2847. Should I also connect you to the legal team?" "Not yet. Just get me Mitchell." As the hold music played over the cabin speakers, a tinny version of Pachelbel's Canon, Patricia Chen pulled out her tablet and began a frantic Google search. Her hands started shaking as the results appeared on her screen. David Williams, CEO, Williams Capital Group, managing $8.2 billion in assets. Named Investment Executive of the Year. Board member, American Airlines. The last line hit her like a physical blow. David Williams wasn't just a passenger. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a board member of the airline, whose employees were currently treating him like a criminal. Peterson, reading over her shoulder, dropped his tablet. It clattered to the floor, papers scattering like leaves in the wind. The hold music stopped. A deep, slightly breathless voice came through the phone. "David, what the hell is going on?" Sarah said. "There was an emergency on flight 2847. And with those words, the balance of power shifted completely. "Hello, Robert," David said calmly into his phone, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I'm standing in the first-class cabin of flight 2847, and your crew seems to think I don't belong here." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. then barely audible through the phone speaker. Jesus Christ. David, I am so sorry. Who's the crew chief? Rebecca Martinez and James Peterson exchanged horrified glances. The realization was dawning on them slowly, like watching a car accident happen in slow motion. They had just spent 45 minutes interrogating and humiliating a member of the American Airlines board of directors. Patricia Chen stepped forward reluctantly, her face ashen. Mr. Williams, I'm Patricia Chen, Customer Relations Director. I just realized who you are, Ms. Chen, David said evenly, his voice steady, despite the rage burning in his chest. Let me ask you something. Did you know who I was when you decided to verify my ability to pay for this ticket? No, sir. Would it have mattered if you had known? The question hung in the air like smoke. Patricia opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Because the honest answer that yes, it would have mattered, would be an admission that American Airlines operated on a two-tiered system of justice, based on perceived status and race. Through the phone speaker, Robert Mitchell's voice was tight with panic. David, I'm in a car heading to JFK right now. Please don't hang up. We need to resolve this immediately. Robert? David said, his voice still maddeningly calm. Before we resolve anything, I need you to understand what just happened here. Your staff accused me of fraud. They demanded I prove I could afford my ticket. They treated me like a criminal in front of 800,000 people who are watching this live. 800,000. Mitchell's voice cracked like a teenager's. Maria Santos, still live streaming from seat 12C, zoomed in on David's face. Her viewer count had indeed hit 800,000, and the number was still climbing. Comments were flooding in so fast, they were impossible to read. Robert. David continued. How long have I been on your board of directors? 3 years. Mitchell answered quietly. And in those 3 years, how much has Williams Capital invested in American Airlines? Approximately $250 million. The numbers hit the cabin like physical blows. Rebecca Martinez stumbled backward against the galley wall, her face white as paper. Peterson picked up his scattered papers with shaking hands. Patricia Chen looked like she might be sick. And what percentage of American Airlines does Williams Capital currently own? Mitchell's voice was barely a whisper. 12%. Gasps rippled through the cabin like a wave. The businessman in seat 3C, who had questioned whether there was a problem, suddenly found his Wall Street Journal very interesting. The woman in 1B, who had suggested they should check these things better, was staring at the floor. David turned to address the cabin directly, his voice carrying the authority that came from boardrooms and corner offices. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your morning. What you've witnessed here is not an isolated incident. It's not a misunderstanding. It's systematic discrimination, and it happens every day to people who don't have the privilege of owning part of the airline. Maria's live stream exploded with comments, "He owns the airline. Plot twist of the century. Those employees are so fired. This is the best karma ever." But David wasn't finished. He was just getting started. Robert, there's something else you need to know. This wasn't an accident. For the past 18 months, I've been conducting an undercover investigation into discrimination in the airline industry. The phone line went dead silent. Even the cabin noise seemed to fade as everyone strained to hear what came next. I've flown commercially 47 times in the past year and a half, documenting every interaction, recording every incident of bias and discrimination. American Airlines has the worst record of any major carrier. David pulled out his tablet and opened a detailed presentation that he had been preparing for months. I have video evidence of 23 separate incidents of discrimination on American Airlines flights. I have audio recordings of discriminatory statements by your employees. I have data showing that passengers of color are questioned about their tickets at 5 times the rate of white passengers. The live stream viewer count hit 1 million. Rebecca Martinez started crying. Not the dignified tears of someone who realized they had made a mistake, but the ugly sobs of someone whose entire world was collapsing. She had built her career on the assumption that she had authority, that she could make judgments about who belonged where, that her prejudices were justified. Peterson leaned against the wall, his face gray as concrete. 22 years with American Airlines, and his career was ending in the most public way possible. Patricia Chen pulled out her phone and typed frantically, "Emergency meeting. All senior staff. Conference room A. Now." David swiped through his tablet, showing screen after screen of documentation. May 15, 2023. Flight 1287 to Chicago. African-American passenger questioned about upgrade eligibility despite having platinum status. June 3, 2023. Flight 892 to Miami. Black family subjected to additional screening because gate agent couldn't verify their tickets. September 12, 2023. Flight 445 to Los Angeles. The list went on and on. Each incident meticulously documented, each case carefully recorded. The scope of the investigation was staggering. This isn't about one flight crew, Robert. This is about company culture. This is about training failures. This is about systematic racism that your airline has ignored for decades. Through the phone, Mitchell's voice was barely audible. "David, what do you want? I want change. Real change. Systematic change." David stood up, addressing not just Mitchell on the phone, but the million people watching the live stream, the cabin full of passengers, and the flight crew whose world had just imploded. "I want comprehensive anti-discrimination training for every employee. I want clear policies with real consequences. I want independent oversight and transparent reporting. I want American Airlines to lead the industry in civil rights, not trail behind it." The live stream comments were a blur of support. "This man is a hero. Change the whole industry. Make them pay justice at 30,000 feet. But David held up his hand, and somehow, even through a phone screen, his authority commanded attention. Most importantly, "I want education, not punishment. The employees who discriminated against me today aren't evil people. They're products of a system that taught them to make assumptions based on race. We can change that system. We can change those assumptions. We can make sure this never happens again." As David spoke, American Airlines headquarters was in full crisis mode. The company's stock price had dropped 8%. The phones were ringing off the hook, with calls from investors, regulators, and reporters. The legal department was preparing for the lawsuits that would inevitably follow. But more than the financial impact, this was a reputational catastrophe that could take years to recover from. The live stream had been shared millions of times. The story was leading every news cycle. American Airlines discrimination was trending worldwide. CEO Mitchell's voice came through the phone, shaky and desperate. "David, I'm pulling up to JFK now. Can you wait for me? We need to discuss this face to face." "Of course," David said, his voice finally showing a hint of emotion. "But Robert, understand this. There are 1 million people watching this conversation. Whatever we discuss, it needs to be transparent, accountable, and meaningful. I understand. Do you? Because after today, American Airlines will either be known as the company that covered up discrimination or the company that led the industry in eliminating it. That choice is yours." As Mitchell's car pulled up to the terminal, David Williams looked around the cabin at the faces staring back at him. Some showed shame. Others showed admiration. Most showed shock at what they had witnessed. But David knew this was just the beginning. The real work, The hard work of changing hearts, minds, and systems was still ahead. At that moment, CEO Robert Mitchell stepped onto the aircraft. He was a man in his 50s, usually confident and commanding. But now he looked exhausted and desperate. His expensive suit was wrinkled from the rushed car ride, his carefully styled hair was disheveled, and his face was pale, with the knowledge that his company's reputation was disintegrating in real time. "David," he said, slightly out of breath, sweat beading on his forehead. "Despite the air conditioning, I came as fast as I could." The live-stream audience watched as the CEO of American Airlines walked down the aisle of his own aircraft to face the board member his employees had been discriminating against for the past hour. "Robert, thank you for coming," David said, standing to shake Mitchell's hand. The gesture was captured by 1 million viewers, analyzed, and screenshot within seconds. "I think it's important that we have this conversation in front of witnesses." Mitchell looked around the cabin, taking in the scene. His crying flight attendant, his shamed supervisor, his terrified customer relations director, and the phones still recording every word and gesture. "David, I want to personally apologize." Mitchell began, his voice hoarse with stress. "Robert," David interrupted gently, "before you apologize, I need you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. This isn't about one incident. This is about systematic discrimination that has been ignored for years." Mitchell nodded, his face grim. As CEO, he knew that every word he spoke in the next few minutes would be analyzed by lawyers, regulators, investors, and the court of public opinion. "What do you need from me?" Mitchell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to listen," David said, his voice growing stronger. "And then I need you to choose whether American Airlines will be part of the problem or part of the solution." David opened his tablet to a comprehensive presentation he had been preparing for months. The first slide showed a systematic analysis of discrimination patterns across the airline industry. "Robert Worse, didn't just document incidents. I studied your company culture. I reviewed training materials, employee handbooks, and internal communications. I analyzed promotion patterns, complaint resolution procedures, and disciplinary actions. The data was damning. In executive positions, American Airlines was 89% white. Discrimination complaints against minority employees were resolved in favor of management 94% of the time. Cultural sensitivity training was optional and poorly attended. Your company has created a culture where employees like Rebecca, James, and Patricia feel empowered to question the humanity and dignity of passengers who don't look like what they think success should look like." Rebecca Martinez, still crying by the galley, looked up at the sound of her name. For the first time since this ordeal began, someone was acknowledging that she wasn't just a villain in this story, she was also a product of a broken system. "But here's what I want you to understand, Robert. Punishment isn't the answer. Revenge isn't the goal. Education is." David turned to address Rebecca directly. She flinched, expecting anger, condemnation, or dismissal. Instead, she found herself looking into the eyes of a man who somehow still retained his humanity despite everything she had put him through. "Rebecca," David said gently, his voice soft with compassion, "can you tell me why you stopped me from entering first class this morning?" She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, then tried again. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I thought there had been a mistake." "But why did you think that?" "My boarding pass was valid. My frequent flyer status was legitimate. My appearance was professional." "What made you assume there was a mistake?" Rebecca struggled with, the question her face red with shame and confusion. "I've never seen someone who looks like you in first class who wasn't an athlete or entertainer." The honesty of the answer cut through the cabin like a knife. It was a confession that revealed everything about unconscious bias, systemic racism, and the narrow definitions of who gets to occupy spaces of privilege. Thank you for being honest, David said, his voice filled with unexpected kindness. Now let me ask you something else. Do you think I deserve to be treated the way you treated me this morning? No, Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face. No, you didn't. Do you think any passenger deserves to be treated that way? No. Then what are you going to do to make sure it never happens again? The question hung in the air, not just for Rebecca, but for everyone watching. Because this wasn't just about one flight attendant's prejudices. This was about how an entire industry could transform itself. David turned back to Mitchell, clicking to a new section of his presentation, the Dignity Protocol, a framework for eliminating discrimination in commercial aviation. Robert, I've spent 18 months documenting the problem, but I've also spent that time developing solutions. The first slide showed a comprehensive training program, unconscious bias recognition, and dignity-centered service. Every employee, from baggage handlers to executives, needs training in recognizing and eliminating unconscious bias. Not a 2-hour seminar, but ongoing education with measurable outcomes and real consequences. Mitchell nodded frantically, taking notes on his phone. His legal team, listening via conference call, was already calculating the costs and liability implications. Next, policy reform and accountability measures. David showed detailed policy language that would make discrimination a fireable offense, create transparent reporting mechanisms, and establish independent oversight. Third, cultural transformation and leadership development. The slide showed promotion and hiring practices designed to diversify leadership mentorship programs for minority employees and community partnership initiatives. This isn't about punishment, Robert. This is about evolution. American Airlines can either continue to be the worst airline for civil rights, or it can become the industry leader in dignity and inclusion. James Peterson, the supervisor, who had spent 40 minutes questioning David's right to exist in first class, stepped forward hesitantly, his voice shaking with emotion. "Mr. Williams," he said, his voice breaking, "I need to say something." David nodded encouragingly, his expression open and patient. "I've been with American Airlines for 22 years. I thought I was good at my job. I thought I was treating people fairly. But watching this, seeing how my behavior looked to other people, I realize I've been part of the problem." Peterson's confession was raw and honest, his voice thick with regret. "I've handled hundreds of situations like this. I always assumed passengers were lying about their status, exaggerating their treatment, playing the race card. I never considered that I might be wrong." "What changed your mind?" David asked, his voice gentle. "Seeing myself through your eyes. Seeing how my behavior looked to a million people watching. Realizing that if my own daughter saw me treating someone this way, she'd be ashamed of me." David stood and extended his hand to Peterson. "James, the fact that you can recognize your mistakes means you can learn from them. That's all any of us can do." The handshake was captured by the live stream, shared millions of times within minutes. It became a symbol of the possibility of redemption, of growth, of the bridge between recognition and reconciliation. Mitchell had been listening carefully, understanding that David was offering him a choice between destruction and transformation. "David, if American Airlines commits to implementing your dignity protocol, what would that look like practically?" David clicked to a detailed implementation timeline. Phase 1. Immediate policy changes and emergency training for all customer-facing staff. Timeline 30 days. Phase 2. Comprehensive bias. Training for all employees from entry level to executive. Timeline 90 days. Phase 3. Cultural transformation initiatives, including diverse hiring, promotion reform, and community partnerships. Timeline 6 months. Phase 4. Independent oversight. transparent reporting, and continuous improvement. Timeline ongoing. The cost. Mitchell asked, his voice tight. $50 million over 3 years. Mitchell winced. In the current financial climate, $50 million was significant. But his CFO, listening via phone, quickly ran the numbers on potential lawsuit settlements, regulatory fines, and lost revenue from boycotts. The Dignity Protocol was actually cheaper than the alternative. But Robert David continued, the return on investment isn't just financial. It's reputational, cultural, and moral. American Airlines can become the airline that families trust, that business travelers respect, that employees are proud to work for. Patricia Chen, who had been silent through most of the conversation, finally spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mr. Williams, I want to ask you something. Why are you offering us education instead of destruction? You could destroy this company. You could ruin our careers. You could cost us millions in lawsuits. Why are you choosing to help us instead?" David considered the question carefully before answering, his voice filled with the wisdom that came from generations of struggle. "Patricia, my grandfather fought for civil rights in the 1960s. He could have chosen anger, hatred, revenge against the people who oppressed him. Instead, he chose education, reconciliation, and hope. He taught me that punishment might change behavior, but only education changes hearts." He paused, looking around the cabin at the faces watching him, each one representing a life that could be transformed. "I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here to build something better." Rebecca, James. Patricia, you're all going to be part of that building process. You're going to help create a company culture where what happened to me this morning becomes impossible. Rebecca stepped forward, wiping tears from her eyes, her voice stronger now. "Mr. Williams, I want to do better. I want to learn. I want to be part of the solution." "Then you will be," David said simply, his voice filled with genuine warmth. Mitchell understood that whatever commitment he made needed to be public, accountable, and irreversible. "David, I want to make a formal commitment here in front of everyone watching. American Airlines will implement your Dignity Protocol in full. We will invest $50 million in transformation. We will submit to independent oversight. We will report our progress transparently." He turned to address the live stream camera, directly, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was promising. "To everyone watching, what happened to Mr. Williams today was unacceptable, inexcusable, and representative of failures in our company culture that we must and will address. We commit to becoming the industry leader in civil rights, dignity, and inclusion." The live stream comments exploded with a mixture of skepticism and hope. "Talk is cheap. Let's see action. This man just changed an entire industry. I'll believe it when I see it. Finally, someone with power using it for good." But David wasn't finished yet. He had one more piece of the puzzle that would ensure lasting change. Robert, the Dignity Protocol also requires establishment of a scholarship program, $50,000 annually for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation. "Agreed," Mitchell said without hesitation. "Anonymous reporting system for discrimination incidents with immediate investigation protocols. Agreed. Executive compensation tied to diversity and inclusion metrics. Agreed. And one more thing," David said, a slight smile crossing his face for the first time. "I want Rebecca promoted to senior flight attendant with a mandate to help develop the new training program." Rebecca gasped, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "Mr. Williams, I can't. After what I did to you." "Rebecca, you can and you will. Leadership requires moral courage and the ability to grow from mistakes. You've demonstrated both today." The cabin erupted in applause. Passengers cheered. The live stream comments exploded with celebration. Mitchell extended his hand to David. "Marcus, I give you my word. This changes today." "Your word isn't enough, Robert. But this is," David said, holding up a legal document he pulled from his briefcase. "This is a binding consent decree. Legal accountability, real consequences, measurable results." "What happens now?" Mitchell asked. "Now we fly to Chicago, and tomorrow we change the airline industry." As the plane pushed back from the gate, David settled into seat 2A, the seat he had paid for, the seat he had been denied, the seat that had started a revolution. The live stream finally ended after nearly 2 hours, but the transformation was just beginning. Within hours of the live stream ending, American Airlines' crisis management team was in full overdrive. The video had been watched over 10 million times across all platforms. Dignity Protocol was trending worldwide. News outlets from CNN to the BBC were covering the story as a watershed moment in corporate accountability. But the real test wasn't the immediate media attention. It was whether American Airlines would follow through on Mitchell's public commitments. David Williams didn't just walk away after the live stream ended. As a board member and major shareholder, he embedded himself in the transformation process, attending every training session, reviewing every policy change, and holding the company accountable to its promises. Rebecca Martinez became the first test case. Instead of being fired, she was enrolled in an intensive diversity and inclusion program. She spent 3 weeks in workshops, attending seminars, and meeting with people whose lives had been affected by discrimination. "It was the hardest 3 weeks of my life," Rebecca would later say, her voice thick with emotion. "I had to confront everything I thought I knew about people, about fairness, about myself. But it was also the most important 3 weeks of my life." The Dignity Protocol training program became a model for the entire service industry. Unlike traditional diversity seminars that focused on compliance and liability, David's program focused on empathy, understanding, and practical skills. Employees participated in simulations where they experienced discrimination firsthand. They heard stories from passengers who had been mistreated. They learned to recognize unconscious bias in real time and develop strategies for interrupting it. James Peterson, the supervisor who had questioned David's right to be in first class, became one of the program's most effective trainers. "I tell new employees," Peterson would say, his voice filled with hard-won wisdom, "that the worst day of my career became the best lesson of my life. I learned that being wrong isn't shameful. Staying wrong is." The training program had measurable results. Within 90 days, discrimination complaints dropped by 67%. Customer satisfaction scores reached all-time highs. Employee satisfaction improved as workers felt more confident and competent in handling diverse customer interactions. Other airlines watched American Airlines' transformation with a mixture of skepticism and envy. When AA's customer satisfaction scores soared and their stock price recovered completely, competitors began implementing similar programs. Delta Airlines hired David as a consultant to develop their own dignity protocol. United Airlines established a chief dignity officer position. Southwest Airlines implemented unconscious bias training for all employees. The Federal Aviation Administration took notice, proposing industry-wide regulations based on the American Airlines model. Congressional hearings were held with David testifying about the economic and social costs of discrimination in commercial aviation. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong. David told the Senate Commerce Committee, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It's economically stupid. When you make customers feel unwelcome, they take their business elsewhere." 6 months after the incident, the key players had all undergone remarkable transformations. Rebecca Martinez had completed her diversity training and was promoted to senior flight attendant. She also enrolled in night school to study social work, inspired by her experience to help others navigate discrimination. "Mr. Williams didn't just change my career," Rebecca said during an interview with CNN. "He changed my life. I see people differently now. I see the world differently. James Peterson was promoted to Regional Training Manager, responsible for implementing the Dignity Protocol across American Airlines' Eastern operations. His daughter, a college freshman, wrote her sociology paper about her father's transformation. My dad went from being part of the problem to being part of the solution, she wrote. He showed me that it's never too late to grow, to learn, to become better. Patricia Chen was appointed Chief Diversity Officer, the first Asian American woman to hold such a position at a major airline. She established partnerships with historically black colleges and universities, creating pipeline programs for diverse talent in aviation. The numbers told the story of systematic transformation. Discrimination complaints down 89%. Customer satisfaction up 34%. Employee satisfaction up 28%. Revenue from first-class bookings up 42%. Stock price up 23% from pre-incident levels. Executive leadership 67% more diverse than industry average. Management positions 45% held by people of color or women. Customer service satisfaction among minority passengers industry leading 94%. But beyond the numbers were the human stories. Families who had stopped flying American Airlines returned as loyal customers. Business travelers specifically chose AA because of their commitment to dignity. Young people of color applied for jobs with the airline, seeing it as a company that valued their humanity. Business schools began teaching the American Airlines case study as an example of crisis-driven transformation. Harvard Business School, Wharton, and Stanford all developed curricula around the Dignity Protocol. Dr. Maria Santos, the same Maria who had live-streamed the original incident, completed her law degree and wrote her dissertation on digital witness and corporate accountability, how social media transforms justice. The American Airlines incident showed that in the age of social media, corporate racism can't hide, Dr. Santos wrote. But more importantly, it showed that individuals with power can choose to use that power for systematic change rather than personal revenge. She approached David with a warm smile, not the forced smile of customer service, but the genuine smile of someone who had learned to see the humanity in every passenger. Mr. Williams, welcome aboard. Is there anything I can get you before takeoff? Actually, Rebecca, there is something. I'd like you to tell me about your day. How are you doing? How's your family? How's school going? They talked for several minutes, not as a board member and employee, but as two people who had been through a transformative experience together. Later, David pulled out his phone and called his daughter Maya, now 9 years old. Hi, Daddy. Are you flying again? Yes, sweetheart. And I wanted to tell you something. Remember when we talked about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard? Uh-huh. Well, sometimes standing up for what's right leads to something beautiful. Sometimes it helps other people learn and grow. Sometimes it makes the world a little bit better. Is that what you did, Daddy? I tried, sweetheart. But more importantly, other people chose to listen, to learn, and to change. That's what really made the difference. As the plane took off, David looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere down there, Rebecca was studying social work to help others. James was training new employees to see dignity in every passenger. Patricia was mentoring young women of color entering the aviation industry. The transformation was real, measurable, and lasting. But David knew it was also fragile. Each generation would have to choose again between prejudice and progress, between comfort and courage, between the way things were and the way things could be. 2 years after the incident that sparked a revolution in commercial aviation, David Williams stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown University. The students, a diverse group of future leaders from around the world, hung on every word as he delivered the commencement address. Graduates. David said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. You are inheriting a world that is both more connected and more divided than ever before. You have technology that can broadcast injustice to millions in real time, but you also have the same systems that can amplify hate and division. He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces, each one representing unlimited potential. The question isn't whether you will witness injustice, you will. The question is what you will do when that moment comes. Will you look away? Will you stay silent? Or will you use whatever power you have, whether it's a phone camera, a social media account, or a position of influence, to stand up for human dignity? The audience was silent, absorbing the weight of the challenge. You don't need to be a CEO or a board member to make a difference. Maria Santos was a law student with a phone when she live-streamed an incident that changed an entire industry. Every person in this room has more power than they realize. David clicked to his final presentation slide, the Dignity Protocol, a framework for global change. The transformation at American Airlines proved that systematic change is possible, but it requires 4 essential elements. First, individual courage. Someone has to be willing to speak up, to document injustice, to refuse to accept discrimination as normal. Second, corporate accountability. Companies must be held responsible for their culture, their training, their outcomes, not just their intentions. Third, consumer power. Every time you choose where to spend your money, you're voting for the kind of world you want to live in. Fourth, systemic reform. Individual and corporate changes are important, but lasting transformation requires new laws, new regulations, new standards that make discrimination costly and dignity profitable. The students began to understand that they weren't just listening to a success story, they were being challenged to continue the work. In the audience, 22-year-old Ashley Chen raised her hand during the question and answer session. Mr. Williams, what you did was incredible, but you had power. You owned part of the airline. You had resources, connections, influence. What about those of us who don't have that kind of power? David smiled, having hoped someone would ask that exact question. Ashley, let me tell you about the real heroes of this story. Maria Santos was a law student when she started live streaming. She had 15,000 followers and a determination to document injustice. Her courage amplified the story to millions of people. Rebecca Martinez was a flight attendant who could have chosen defensiveness and denial when confronted with her bias. Instead, she chose growth, education, and transformation. James Peterson was a middle manager who could have transferred blame and avoided responsibility. Instead, he became one of our most effective trainers. Patricia Chen could have seen diversity and inclusion as a burden on her career. Instead, she made it her life's work. He leaned forward, speaking directly to Ashley, but addressing the entire audience. None of these people had traditional power when this story began, but they all chose to use whatever influence they had, a phone camera, a position of authority, a willingness to change, to make a difference. The final question came from a young woman named Maya, not David's daughter, but a 21-year-old sociology major whose own name carried the weight of history. Mr. Williams, it's been 2 years since your incident. How do we keep the momentum going? How do we prevent people from forgetting, from getting comfortable, from sliding back into old patterns? David was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own daughter Maya, now 10 years old, and beginning to understand the world's complexities. Maya. That's the most important question anyone has asked today. Because change isn't a destination, it's a journey. Every generation has to choose again between prejudice and progress. He shared data showing that while progress had been remarkable, it wasn't irreversible. Some companies had quietly rolled back diversity programs. Some employees had returned to old habits when oversight decreased. Some consumers had forgotten their commitments to supporting inclusive businesses. Sustaining change requires vigilance, accountability, and continuous education. It requires each of you to document injustice when you see it, to speak up, when others stay silent, to use your power, whatever power you have, to protect human dignity. As the speech concluded, David made a personal appeal to each graduate. Before you leave here today, I want you to make a commitment not to me, but to yourself and to the world you want to create. Commit to never being a bystander to injustice. Commit to using your voice, your vote, your wallet to support dignity and equality. Commit to growing, learning, and changing when you discover your own biases. Commit to raising the next generation to see humanity in everyone they meet. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but David knew that applause was easy. The real test would come in the days, months, and years ahead, when these graduates faced their own moments of choice between comfort and courage. That evening, David called his daughter Maya from his hotel room. "Hi, Daddy. How was your speech?" "It was good, sweetheart. I talked to a lot of young people who want to make the world better. Like what you did on the airplane." "Exactly like that. Maya, can I ask you something?" "Sure. When you grow up, what kind of world do you want to live in?" Maya was quiet for a moment, thinking with the seriousness that children bring to important questions. "I want to live in a world where everyone is nice to everyone and no one is mean to people because of how they look." "That's a beautiful dream, sweetheart. And you know what? That world is possible. But it takes work from people like those college students I talked to today. And someday, it will take work from you too." "I can do that, Daddy. I know you can. And I'll be here to help you learn how." As David hung up the phone, he thought about the long arc of progress that stretched from his grandfather's civil rights activism through his father's corporate struggles to his own moment of choice on Flight 2847. Each generation had faced their own version of the same fundamental question. How do we treat people who are different from us? The answer wasn't complicated, but it wasn't easy either. It required choosing dignity over prejudice, education over ignorance, courage over comfort, love over fear. 5 years after the incident that changed commercial aviation, David Williams stood in the first-class cabin of an American Airlines aircraft, not as a passenger, but as a board member, conducting his quarterly dignity assessment. It was something he did regularly, now traveling unannounced on flights to observe how the dignity protocol was being implemented in real-world conditions. The transformation was remarkable. Flight attendants greeted every passenger with genuine warmth. Gate agents helped travelers navigate complex itineraries without judgment. Security personnel conducted screenings with professionalism and respect, regardless of a passenger's appearance or background. But David wasn't just observing. He was also traveling to the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he would present the latest research on how dignity-centered business practices were reshaping entire industries. Rebecca Martinez had just completed her master's degree in social work and was preparing to start her new role as American Airlines Director of Passenger Advocacy. Her office walls were covered with letters from passengers thanking her for her compassionate service photos from diversity training sessions she had led, and her framed diploma. When people ask me about that day 5 years ago, Rebecca would tell her training groups, her voice filled with hard-won wisdom. I tell them it was the worst and best day of my career. Worst, because I had to confront the ugly truth about my own biases. Best, because it started a journey of growth that changed my entire life. Rebecca had become one of the most requested speakers at diversity conferences across the industry. Her presentations weren't academic theories about unconscious bias. They were raw, honest accounts of personal transformation. James Peterson had been promoted to Vice President of Operations Training, overseeing dignity education for over 50,000 American Airlines employees across the globe. His transformation from the supervisor who questioned David's right to first class to the executive leading industry-wide change had become legendary within the company. "I used to think my job was to catch people doing something wrong," Peterson said during a recent interview with Aviation Week magazine. "Now I understand my job is to help people do something right." Patricia Chen had been promoted to Senior Vice President of Global Diversity and Inclusion, making her one of the highest-ranking Asian American executives in the airline industry. Under her leadership, American Airlines had established partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities, created mentorship programs for underrepresented groups, and implemented supply chain diversity requirements that directed billions of dollars to minority-owned businesses. Robert Mitchell had just been re-elected to his third term as CEO of American Airlines, largely based on the company's reputation as an industry leader in civil rights and customer service. Under his leadership, American Airlines had become the most diverse major airline in the world and consistently ranked highest in customer satisfaction. Dr. Maria Santos had completed her law degree and earned a PhD in digital civil rights. She now directed the Institute for Technology and Justice at Columbia University, where she studied how social media and digital technology could be used to document injustice and drive systematic change. Williams Capital Group had grown into a global investment firm, managing over $15 billion in assets. But more than financial success, the company had become known for using its influence to promote corporate social responsibility and diversity across its portfolio companies. David's marriage to Sarah had grown stronger through the challenges and triumphs of the past 5 years. As a pediatrician, Sarah had established free clinics in underserved communities, funded by the Williams Foundation. Her work treating children from all backgrounds had reinforced the family's commitment to dignity and equity. Their daughter Maya, now 13 years old, had grown up understanding that her father's experience on Flight 2847 wasn't just a story, it was a call to action. She volunteered at community centers, participated in peer mediation programs at school, and had started a blog about young people fighting injustice. "My dad taught me that when you see something wrong, you don't look away," Maya wrote in her 8th grade civics project. "You figure out how to make it right." The commercial aviation industry had been fundamentally transformed. The Federal Aviation Administration had mandated dignity protocols for all airlines. International aviation organizations had adopted similar standards. Discrimination complaints had dropped 84% industry-wide over 5 years. But the changes went beyond aviation. The hotel industry had implemented dignity training after several high-profile discrimination incidents. Retail chains had adopted bias recognition programs. Banks had established fairness protocols for customer interactions. The Dignity Protocol had been implemented by organizations in 47 countries. The United Nations had recognized David Williams as a global champion for human dignity. The World Economic Forum had established an annual award for companies demonstrating exceptional commitment to inclusive practices. But David knew that awards and recognition weren't the point. The point was creating a world where his daughter Maya, and every child who looked like her, could exist in any space without having to prove they belonged there. On the 5th anniversary of Flight 2847, David Williams returned to JFK Airport. He walked through the same terminal, passed the same gate, and boarded the same route to Chicago. But this time, he wasn't traveling for a business meeting. He was traveling to deliver the keynote address at the National Civil Rights Convention. As he settled into seat 2A, the same seat he had been denied 5 years earlier, David reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about his grandfather, who had fought for the right to sit at lunch counters and ride in the front of buses. He thought about his father, who had broken barriers in corporate America while enduring daily indignities. He thought about Maya, who was growing up in a world where dignity was increasingly seen as a right, not a privilege. The flight attendant approached a young black woman named Keisha, who had been hired as part of American Airlines' diversity recruitment program. "Mr. Williams, welcome aboard. Is there anything I can get you before takeoff?" "Actually, Keisha, I'd like to hear about your experience working here. How has the company treated you? Do you feel supported? Do you feel valued?" They talked for several minutes. Keisha shared her story of growing up in Detroit, working 3 jobs to pay for college and dreaming of a career in aviation. American Airlines had recruited her from Howard University, provided extensive training, and created mentorship opportunities that helped her advance quickly. "Mr. Williams," Keisha said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I want to thank you. I know what you did on this route 5 years ago. Because of your courage, I have opportunities that might not have existed before." David smiled, his heart full. "Keisha, your success isn't because of my courage. It's because of your talent, your hard work, and your determination. I just helped remove some barriers that never should have existed in the first place." That evening, David stood before 5,000 civil rights activists, community leaders, and young people at the National Civil Rights Convention. The auditorium was packed with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms. 5 years ago, David began his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "I was denied a seat on an airplane because someone made assumptions about who I was based on the color of my skin. Today I stand before you not as a victim of discrimination, but as a witness to the power of choosing education over retribution, growth over grudges, and transformation over revenge." He paused, looking out at the diverse audience, each face representing a story of struggle and hope. "The incident on Flight 2847 taught me something profound. Individual courage can spark systematic change, but only when institutions choose to embrace that change rather than resist it." To the young people in the audience, David said, "You are growing up in a world where injustice is harder to hide. Your phones can broadcast discrimination to millions. Your social media can organize movements for change. Your votes can demand accountability from leaders." He clicked to his final slide, a photo of Maya Williams, now 13, speaking at her school's diversity assembly. "This is my daughter, Maya. She's growing up in a world where the incident on Flight 2847 seems almost unimaginable to her generation. Not because discrimination has disappeared, but because her generation has been raised to recognize it and reject it." David's voice grew passionate as he delivered his closing challenge. "Your generation has tools my grandfather could never have imagined. You have platforms my father never accessed. You have opportunities I had to fight to create. The question is, what will you do with that power? Will you use your voice to amplify justice or to spread division? Will you use your privilege to open doors or to close them? Will you use your influence to build bridges or to construct walls? Will you choose the hard work of understanding and education or the easy path of anger and retribution?" The standing ovation lasted for 12 minutes. But more importantly, the speech was live-streamed to over 2 million viewers worldwide, inspiring similar movements in countries across the globe. That night, David called Maya from his hotel room in Chicago, his voice tired but filled with satisfaction. "Hi, Daddy. How was your speech?" "It was wonderful, sweetheart. I talked about courage, dignity, and the power of choosing to grow instead of staying stuck in anger." "Did you tell them about our family?" "I did. I told them about your grandfather, who fought for civil rights, about your grandmother, who broke barriers in medicine, and about you, the young woman who will inherit the world we're creating." Maya was quiet for a moment. At 13, she was beginning to understand the weight of legacy and the responsibility of privilege. "Daddy, Do you think the world will be fair when I grow up? David considered his answer carefully, choosing his words with the precision that came from years of difficult conversations. Maya, fairness isn't something that just happens. It's something each generation has to choose and create. Your generation will face different challenges than mine, but you'll also have different tools and opportunities. What if I make mistakes like those people on the airplane? Then you'll learn from them, grow from them, and help other people learn and grow too. The goal isn't to be perfect, sweetheart. The goal is to keep getting better. As David hung up the phone, he felt the weight and wonder of what had transpired over the past 5 years. He thought about the long arc of progress that connected his grandfather's lunch counter sit-ins to his own airplane aisle confrontation, to Maya's generation of digital natives who could organize global movements with a hashtag. Each generation had to choose between fear and love, between division and unity, between the comfort of prejudice and the challenge of growth. But David also knew the work was far from over. Despite remarkable progress, he remained vigilant about the challenges still ahead. New forms of discrimination emerged as society evolved. Bias against transgender individuals, discrimination based on religion or immigration status, and subtle forms of racism that adapted to avoid detection all required ongoing attention. Discrimination is like a virus, David had said during his recent interview with 60 Minutes, his voice carrying the weight of experience. It mutates, adapts, and finds new ways to spread. Our commitment to dignity has to be stronger than hatred's commitment to division. During his quarterly dignity assessments, David still occasionally witnessed subtle forms of bias. A gate agent who processed white passengers more quickly. A flight attendant who was more patient with some passengers than others. A security officer who subjected certain travelers to additional scrutiny. But now there were systems in place to address these issues immediately. Anonymous reporting mechanisms allowed passengers and employees to document bias safely. Swift investigation procedures ensured rapid resolution. Ongoing training helped staff recognize and interrupt their own unconscious assumptions. The story had come full circle, but the circle itself was expanding. What began as one man's humiliation in an airplane aisle had become a global template for transformation. The dignity protocol was being implemented in hospitals where patients of color had historically received substandard care. It was being adopted by banks where lending discrimination had persisted for decades. It was being integrated into educational systems where minority students had long faced lower expectations and fewer opportunities. As David prepared for sleep in his Chicago hotel room, he pulled out his phone one more time. There was a text from Rebecca Martinez, now Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had just defended her doctoral dissertation in social work. Mr. Williams, I wanted you to be the first to know. My research on dignity-centered customer service has been accepted for publication in the Journal of Applied Psychology. Thank you for seeing the teacher in me when I could only see the failure. There was another message from James Peterson, whose daughter had just been accepted to Harvard Law School with a full scholarship from the Williams Foundation. David's Sarah got into Harvard. She wants to specialize in civil rights law. She says she wants to finish the work we started. I couldn't be prouder. And finally, a message from Patricia Chen, who was boarding a flight to Geneva where she would present the Dignity Protocol to the World Health Organization. The model is going global, David. 27 countries have committed to implementing dignity-centered practices in their healthcare systems. The ripples keep spreading. David smiled as he read the messages. This was the real measure of success, not the awards or recognition, but the human lives that had been transformed, the careers that had been redirected toward justice, the next generation that was inheriting a more dignified world. He thought about Maria Santos now, Dr. Santos, whose live stream had captured a moment of injustice and transformed it into a catalyst for change. She was teaching the next generation of activists how to use technology as a tool for justice. Her students were documenting discrimination in refugee camps, exposing bias in artificial intelligence systems, and organizing global campaigns for human rights. The ripple effects continued to spread in ways that even David couldn't have imagined. A young woman in South Africa had used the American Airlines case study to successfully challenge discrimination at her local bank. A student in India had implemented a dignity protocol at his university that eliminated caste-based bias in admissions. A small hotel chain in rural Alabama had adopted the training program and seen their customer satisfaction scores double. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was taking place in David's own home. Maya, now a teenager, had become a passionate advocate for justice in her own right. She volunteered at immigrant support centers, participated in anti-bullying programs at school, and had started a YouTube channel where she interviewed other young activists from around the world. Dad, Maya had said to him just the week before, "I want to understand something. When you were standing in that airplane aisle 5 years ago, when everyone was watching and judging, what kept you from just walking away?" David had thought carefully before answering, wanting to give his daughter the truth she deserved. "Sweetheart, there was a moment when I wanted to walk away. It would have been easier to just take a seat in coach, avoid the confrontation, get to my meeting on time. But then I thought about you, about me. I thought about the world I wanted you to grow up in. I thought about whether I wanted you to live in a world where people could be denied dignity based on the color of their skin, or whether I wanted to fight for a world where everyone is treated with respect. And once I framed it that way, the choice was easy." Maya had hugged him, then her arms strong around his waist. "Dad, I'm proud of you, not just for what you accomplished, but for who you chose to be in that moment." As David finally drifted off to sleep in his Chicago hotel room, his last thought was of the morning 5 years ago when he had promised Maya he would be home for dinner. He had kept that promise, but more than that, he had kept the deeper promise, the one he had made to generations past and future, to use whatever power he had to make the world more just, more dignified, more humane. The seat that had once been denied to him had become a symbol that change is always possible. The airplane aisle where discrimination was exposed had become a classroom for transformation. The live stream that documented injustice had become a template for accountability. And most importantly, the decision to choose education over revenge, growth over grudges, and love over hate had proven that even in the darkest moments, the possibility for redemption and transformation remained. Somewhere over America, on flights crisscrossing the continent, passengers of every background sat in seats they had paid for, treated with the dignity they deserved, in an industry that had learned to value humanity over assumptions. The transformation was complete, but the vigilance was eternal. The work continued, one flight at a time, one interaction at a time, one choice at a time, one generation at a time. The seat that changed everything had become proof that everything can change. David Williams had boarded flight 2847 as a successful businessman trying to get to an important meeting. He had left that flight as something more, a catalyst for change, a bridge between what was and what could be, a living reminder that individual courage amplified by collective action can transform systems that seem immutable. The story that began with, "Excuse me, sir, but I don't think you understand," had ended with a deeper understanding of human dignity, corporate responsibility, and the power of choosing transformation over retribution. 5 years later, the legacy lived on in Rebecca's social work, in James's training programs, in Patricia's diversity initiatives, in Maria's academic research, in Maya's activism, and in the millions of passengers who flew each day in a more dignified world. The seat that changed everything had become a symbol that everything can change if we have the courage to demand it. the wisdom to nurture it, and the persistence to sustain it. And in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, in a drawing that hung on a refrigerator door, a stick-figure family still carried the words, "My hero." Dad written in purple crayon, a reminder that the most important transformations happen not in boardrooms or on live streams, but in the hearts of children who inherit the world we choose to create. The story was complete, but the movement continued. The seat that changed everything had proven that everything can change. The only question that remained was what each person would choose to do with that knowledge. The answer, like the future itself, was still being written.